I really loved your book, by the way, and I
Thank you.
thought it was very beautiful, very eloquent. I like the combination of this very intimate, personal observations with sort of philosophy and high abstraction.
The book was really for me an attempt to see the experience as a whole, the
Hmm.
becoming a young chess player and being highly driven to win. So
Yeah.
developing this strong competitive urge, which was also about advancement and identity and personal growth.
Hmm.
And then at some point, partly through becoming a father, partly through just growing up, beginning to realize there were other ways to live your life. That it
Yeah.
wasn't just about your next competitive victory. So that was the book. In some ways, is making sense of those different impulses. On the one hand, the natural competitive urge to win and the
Hmm.
excitement of all that.
Yeah.
Then sort of saying goodbye to it as well. Sort of
Yeah.
fond
Well, I
farewell.
noticed that there's this kind of paradox in your character, right? There's chess being extremely hyper competitive and almost warrior like, and actually what really matters to you is the more carrying aspect of life on some level.
Possibly, yeah. So as you probably know, the warrior archetype type is partly about a kind of sublimation. It's partly about finding something that's worth living for and focusing all your energy on that and mobilizing
Hmm.
as if at war for that end. So that spirit of single-minded attention. I've got a lot of respect for it. I see it in people. I see its power. I see how it can forge great progress. I see how it can cut through a lot of noise. I admire it, and I think it's a necessary energy in the world. I also think there's more to life, and that something somewhere along the way that ceased to make as much sense to me. That desire. I remember one time being in a hotel room in Spain, and I mentioned this in the book, and just sort of trying to sort of get ready for the next game, trying to find that warrior who wanted to win the tournament and beat the guy next. And I just noticed that that wasn't me anymore. I still
Hmm.
respected it. I could still just about pretend to be that person, but I began to think there are bigger battles to be fought and won. So
Do you think being a full-on warrior has more to do with the grace of learning how to lose in some sense, learning how to be broken or learning how to lose gracefully? Because none of us sort of rise to the extreme image of ourself,
right.
become the divine double. There's a word that John Vervaeke was using. And so we always fall short of that on a human level. And becoming human in some sense has to do with failure as much as
Right.
winning.
Yes. So there's, as you probably know, in the book, The Moves That Matter, there was a little bit of an anti-heroic side to it. It's partly about me coming to terms with the fact that I was never going to be world champion. And I didn't really ever try or ever have a very serious chance at that. But there were maybe moments of inflection when, after a particularly big tournament or a great run, I might have got ideas that, oh, maybe I can go all the way. But at some point, you kind of reach your limitations. You play people and you know that that was no accident that you lost that game. You may learn, you may play a bit better next time, but there are clear limitations. And I think that's true in almost any dimension of life. Better philosophers, better activists, better fathers. You
Mhm.
know, I think it's something about growing up that you come to appreciate your strengths and weaknesses and get to know yourself a bit better as a result. For me in
Yeah.
chess, it was something about letting go of that ultimate desire to be more at ease with what had happened.
Right. Is it also something to do with at one point deciding to let go of being a specialist in one field? I know in my 20s I wanted to be a songwriter. It was like I was driven to that. It was the only thing I cared about. And then at one point I came to the realization that I got married and I all these
Right.
other things happened to me which made it impossible to be so one pointedly devoted to that one goal, and my life became more diverse and rich, but I couldn't concentrate on that one thing to the degree that I wanted to.
Yes, that's very pertinent because it reminds me of the quotation I think by Joseph Campbell, who asked, "Which myth are you living by?"
Yeah.
And I think in the case of my younger self, this single-pointed attention, this mobilized the will and the heart and the soul and the mind to get as good as possible at this one thing, chess. That was very much part of the story. It was about let me show the world that I can focus. Let me
Yeah.
show the world that I can dedicate myself to this through discipline. And there's a lot of self-love in that, for
Mm.
good and bad. There was a sort of genuine discipline and formation of character. Without chess, that wouldn't have happened. On the other hand, that monomania, that sense that A, I was really important, B, the game was really important, and C, the next game and the next move really mattered. These were all kind of part of the myth, and at some point you
Mm.
begin to realize you're telling the story of yourself, and there are other ways of telling that story. So yes, marriage was part of it. Doing, my educational activities was part of it. Chess was always a kind of plan B. It's like, I didn't know what plan A was yet, but I just knew that chess wasn't it. It was more like what I was doing when I wasn't doing something else.
Interesting. You seem to have this very powerful sense of direction in your life. And I also want to know about your boyhood when you were younger. And I want to go back to chess a little bit. When I was reading the book, I was thinking about, in one sense, it's the form of ultimate escapism. And the other sense, it's a form of actually going deeper into life.
Well, as I say in the book, chess was initially just a family pursuit like any other, like a game, like football, like Monopoly, just something we did. But then somewhere along the way, I got good enough at it to begin to feel it was a bit more meaningful than that it was a kind of cultural practice, that I was taking part in a tradition of some kind.
Mhm.
That there were
An
these
art also, and a sport as well, but something between.
yeah, but it was a structured form of life
Mhm.
in a way that maybe Tiddlywinks wasn't, or there was a sort of sense of being part of an institution or a tradition. And then I got to meet some grown-ups who were part of that world, and I quite liked them, and I was very curious about the world they were in. And then various things happened in my family. My father's mental illness became worse. My parents split up. My brother became unwell. I buried my head in books for school to some extent, but the main coping mechanism was chess.
Mm.
And it was a field of life where I was in control, where I was independent mostly. I mean, actually thoroughly dependent on others in some ways. Families who would drive me to tournaments, and people who would feed me, and people who would pay the tournament entry fee, but still psychologically fairly independent. A certain amount of escapism, but in the book I write about this, there's a whole chapter on escapism in some ways. And I call it the chapter, the sort of lesson of the chapter. Each chapter has a kind of takeaway idea. And in this one, it's we have to make peace with our struggle.
Mm.
I think that's for me what chess was about. It wasn't wishing away wanting to be a different family or wanting to be another person, but it was a way of sort of reenacting and re-experiencing the struggle I was going through, and to some extent overcoming it, because I kept on facing this resistance and these battles, getting better and better and better, and feeling myself growing in autonomy and mastery. It was a kind of relief, and also a way of feeling safe, in a sense,
Mhm.
rather than trying to retreat from the world. That was sort of deeper into the fight, and
Mm.
winning it
Mm.
sort of mattered.
So almost like you need to do battle in an imaginative realm before you can do battle in the real world.
Something like that. Although remember, we're talking about a young boy here
Yeah.
who I now have children of a similar age when I started playing chess, and they don't have that much power. They might think they do, but it wasn't. It was something about experiencing through the game what I couldn't experience or feel properly. In that sense, it was very important.
And also there's other thing I was thinking about as I was reading your book was, in one level, it's a game, it's fun, it doesn't have a meaning to it except in a game. So there's this paradox between it being deadly serious and being just absurd play.
Right, absolutely. So
I love that, and all the characters that you met who play chess, and these maverick figures, and it's like an alternative universe, but it's also very real and more real than real on some
right,
level.
absolutely. And so it speaks to life in general in that sense. And what you just mentioned there's a version of that in the book. The writer George Steiner, whom I believe, New York, wrote for the New Yorker at
Uh-huh.
least, and many other places. but he described chess as ultimately insignificant but enormously meaningful.
Yeah, there you go.
Ultimately insignificant but enormously meaningful, and that is true to my experience.
Yeah.
And I suppose I wrote the book because both things seem equally true. And in some ways, it was a way of processing what that had been about. And by the end of it, you know how it ends with the poem and everything. I sort of feel it a little bit more of the. I feel them both ultimately insignificant and enormously meaningful.
Yeah.
But I managed to feel at peace with it being ultimately insignificant
That's great. Yeah.
without losing the meaning.
Well, so maybe the work of articulating that in your book, because a lot of people have a sport or have a something they do that they excel at, but they don't have the gift of articulating that at the same time. So that's kind of interesting that you can articulate that in such a way.
It took a long time, and writing a book is a big commitment. I think there's a lovely line by Ted Hughes, the poet. He says that we write to take fuller possession of our experience.
That's it. That's it.
And that's how it feels. I feel as though, in developmental terms, previously sort of chess had me for many years, but now through the process of writing the book, there's a sense in which I have chess. It's still there, but I'm no longer lost in it somehow.
You're no longer lost in it, and it's been a platform for you to move into all these other things that matter to you.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
In terms of the other question you asked about direction, I'm quite pleasantly bemused by that, in the sense that
Okay.
I don't obviously recognize myself in that. However, I suppose it can look like that retrospectively. Like, our lives teach us who we are, and there were certainly some lean years where I spent 2 or 3 years doing nothing in particular, with chess. Chess was a kind of cover story for that.
Ah, that's great. I love that, because it looks like you have all this like direction, but much of the learning is just fooling around. It's just just in between things, and traveling around and just fooling around, and
quite a lot of existential angst along the way of what am I doing? Failed applications, careers attempted, languages begun and dropped. Various unfinished businesses. But when you look back, I don't really regret any of it. I'm quite glad for all those different false roads and false starts. You sort of need them somehow